Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
The gamekeeper who turns poacher is the most effective poacher of them all. Our first guest, Tony Norfield, is such a man. A former banker, senior economist at Bank of America International, and global head of foreign exchange strategy at ABN Amro, among other roles.
He's written a devastating new book called The City, London and the Global Power of Finance, which exposes the corruption and greed of the banking system here and abroad, where it is the weapon of choice for rich countries looting the poor.
And I'm glad to say he joins us now on the Sputnik. Congratulations on the book, first of all, Tony, a great piece of work published by Verso. It's not just the banks, is it? It's the financial system itself.
Yes, that's a strong point of the book, actually, that whereas there's been, especially since the financial crisis, a lot of focus of people that, you know, the horrible banksters, they're ripping us off. I think you get a more devastating critique of capitalism today when you look instead at how the financial system is part of the expression of power of the major countries. And it's corporations, governments, really even more than the banks, in terms of getting control over the world's resources, dominating the world economy, and generally getting their way.
And yet there's no alternative to it, really, is there?
Under capitalism, no. So the book is basically anti-capitalist. So I'm not suggesting that there's regulation that can be done, or, you know, you do various things to rein the banks in and somehow that solves the problem. I think the problem
that might be a start, yeah?
Yeah.
Glass-Steagall might be a start, a bit more regulation than the Blair-Brown era heralded.
Well, even if you look at Glass-Steagall, what happened instead was the American banks went overseas. They did all kinds of subsidiaries to do the operations that Glass-Steagall would have prevented them doing. And the development of the euro markets in the 50s and 60s was based around avoiding Glass-Steagall and getting access to international funds. So you can put regulations in place, but it then leads to the financial system doing something else. Because, you know, capitalist exploitation, the way capitalist markets work, they'll always find a way of using regulation systems and getting around them.
You were at the heart of capitalism in the very high positions that you held within the system. Did you have a moment of epiphany in which you saw the light, or underneath your banker suit was there always beating an anti-capitalist heart?
Basically, I've been a Marxist all my adult life, and I haven't really changed on that score.
Did you tell them that at ABN Amro?
No, the good thing about it, and this is one of the ironies of the working in the financial system or in a dealing room, they're not so bothered about what your views are. It's, can you tell them which way the market is going? And I found, especially in the foreign exchange field, you had less of a requirement to say, you know, Chief Executive X is a wonderful person, or the Chancellor is doing such a splendid job. Really, the point was, is it going down or is it going up? Tell me when, how much, et cetera, et cetera. And as long as you did that, you're okay. So really, I was glad that I wasn't working so much in, say, the bond or the equity markets, where the pressure on individuals to, you know, tell the story to support the system, it was far less the case. And basically, I used to...
But you were helping the enemy make very big profits.
I was trying to understand how the system worked and said, well, OK, I think this currency is going down or up or whatever. And, you know, it's going to happen no matter what I say about it.
And what I wonder is, did you encounter a lot of people of your line, or were you lowly in there?
They're pretty thin on the ground, I would say.
Not many Marxists in the square mile. Although, actually, they have to concede the genius and greatness of Marx, and indeed the Financial Times not that long ago, at the time of the crash, partially rehabilitated Marx, as of course they had to, because the predictions or the line of march predicted by Marx came to pass, no?
Yeah, there was, it was only a brief period, I must say. And this was more when all of these standard economic theories, you know, lauding free markets and all this kind of thing, and how it's going to be wonderful for everyone, clearly was so patently at variance with reality that you found a number of commentators would, you know, look back, say maybe what Marx was saying, et cetera, et cetera. I think
but they quickly recovered their poise.
Yeah, well, I think they haven't really recovered, actually. But instead, they're flailing around trying to find other ways to make the system work, and they're basically running out of options.
Marx's analysis, though, was that the system was doomed. Do you think it's doomed? I mean, I'm not young anymore, and I've been predicting the demise of capitalism for a very long time, and people have been doing so in previous generations. Can capitalism survive?
The system is systematically dysfunctional, more and more violence, and increasingly so you find that it's even happening in the richer countries now, whereas prior to that, say 20-odd years ago, most of the depredations in poor countries kind of went by the wayside. Nobody really cared that much about them. They weren't on popular news programs. So as long as things in, say, Western Europe or North America are okay, or Japan, that was all fine. Capitalism is wonderful. What has happened, I think, which has led to a crisis in most of the ruling elites in the major powers, is that it's becoming pretty clear that you've got mass unemployment, especially youth unemployment in many countries. The system doesn't work, and all of their nostrums of, you know, independent central banks, et cetera, all of these apparent rules that would make everything work wonderfully forever, they've all fallen to pieces. So you find that, you know, very traditional conservative central bankers are coming up with policies that would be considered outrageously radical or breaking all the rules. You know, even Mark Carney, a week ago, the Bank of England, promising to buy. Yeah, this I found quite extraordinary, and I think was the amazing thing from him. He wanted to buy, not simply buying corporate bonds, bonds of companies, £10 billion worth, but companies who were doing good for the UK economy. And that completely contradicts all of the free and fair, open, level playing field, et cetera, things. And I think it's a sign of a growing nationalism in the major powers. Only a very small sign, admittedly, but it's one which reflects the fact that they've more or less run out of policies, and they're still flailing around trying to figure out what to do to get the system on its feet. I'm
reading at the moment the diaries of the Soviet ambassador to London, Ivan Maysky, from 1930 to 1943, in which he records a conversation with Anthony Eden, who became the Conservative Prime Minister, predicting exactly what you've just been describing, and hoping, Eden was, that at least communism, when it comes, it can be a kind of conservative communism, a very British form of communism. It's well worth a read. Are we heading for another crash? And if so, what form will it take? And when will it be? You're a great expert at predicting trends. My view is that we're past the so-called acute phase of the crisis, and instead we're in the chronic phase of the crisis. So in the same way, somebody with a debilitating chronic disease might look a bit okay one day and get up, even go for a walk. The problem is the underlying problems are still there, and they're not being resolved. So
you find this reflected in still huge levels of debt, certainly in all the rich countries, but in the past 5, 6, 7 years, the levels of debt have risen dramatically in poorer countries too. China, Turkey, a lot of Asian countries, African countries, etc.
This is state debt, though.
Yeah.
No, not necessarily.
In our case, isn't our crisis private debt as well as state debt?
Well, the joke is that a lot of the private debt was taken over by the states. That's especially the case in the US. You know, the US Fed has got the equivalent of 25% of America's GDP on its books in the form of having bought US treasuries, government securities, and mortgage-backed securities, right? So you find, I mentioned this example in the book, but it's the case that the US Federal Reserve is probably effectively the largest landlord in the US now, or largest kind of, how can I put it, mortgage lender, effectively. Yeah. So they've bought the mortgage-backed securities, so the interest payments made by ordinary US citizens paying off their mortgage, a lot of that is going to the US Federal Reserve. You know, and as I say, the wonders and innovation of capitalism know few bounds, really.
Absolutely. Now, the banks were held to be too big to fail. In the years since, the bankers too big to jail. Did you come across many of your contemporaries in the city who really ought to have been in jail?
Not particularly, I must say. I mean, I'm not kind of, you know, hiding names in my back pocket or something like this. I'm actually more in the foreign exchange area, although it's been in the news for rate fixing.
Some of them did go to jail.
Yeah.
One of the, I think 3 of them have gone to jail. 3 of the only people in the whole crisis.
Yeah, sure. And they more or less made sure that the people handling the big securities operations were left untouched. And I was working largely in the foreign exchange area, so I would consider what they did, it broke the rules, but frankly, it's no big deal. And even on fixing LIBOR, a lot of the time, when this story came up, there's kind of populist attack on banks. They're fixing LIBOR, ripping you off. Half the time, they were fixing LIBOR to make it lower, to show that their own bank was not having to borrow at too high a rate. So ironically, the banks fixing LIBOR were often reducing people's mortgage rates rather than raising them. And this is something, of course, you don't get...
Send them to the House of Lords, never mind. Public-spirited chaps. It's a terrific book, The City, and I hope it does very well. Published by Verso.
Yep.
I got that right. I hope people read it. It's very illuminating indeed. And congratulations for coming out of the city in your true light. Thanks very much, Tony.
Okay.
Welcome back to Sputnik. For me, the Olympic Games is an epic waste of time and money, and that's at the best of times. It usually ruins the people who host it and is an exercise in persuading us that people we've never heard of have become heroes because they were 4th in sports we've scarcely heard of and wouldn't dream ordinarily of watching.
Since 1936, in Hitler's Berlin, it has been used as propaganda on a grand scale. The US-led boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and now the crude collective punishment of Russia in the Rio Paralympics, tipping disabled athletes out of their wheelchairs before they got to their starting lines. And it has been accompanied by the full blast of cheap jeers from the US athletes and a Russophobic media chorus.
But there are, of course, moments of pure gold, too. Our next guest is a chronicler of those and has a brand new and wonderful book called The Games, published by Macmillan. He's David Goldblatt, and there's nothing about the Olympics, from Jesse Owens to Teofilo Stevenson, that he's left out. It's a medal-winning effort, and he joins us now. David, congratulations, a fantastic book on both sides of the Atlantic. I prefer the British cover myself. Tell us about the contents.
Well, the contents is an attempt to write, the first proper social, political and cultural history of the Olympics. And hitherto, actually, we've only had two, one written back in the 1980s, and also, obviously, a lot of water under the bridge since then. And then we have an official history by Mr. David Miller. And I have to say, as official histories go, it's actually pretty good. But all of the, the political dimension is completely written out of it. And given that, as you say, these gargantuan amounts of money are spent on it, and up to 3 billion people are actually watching the damn thing, I thought it was time to actually give it the full narrative and political history.
Actually, the numbers I learned from you were even more startling than I thought. 20 billion to put on a Games, 10 billion if you're really lucky in revenue. That leaves a big hole in anybody's budget, no?
The whole economics of the Olympics has gone mad. I mean, people sort of talk about how much money there is in sponsorship and broadcasting, but that actually adds up to no more than around 4 billion over the 4-year Olympic cycle, nearly all of which is spent by the IOC either on itself or supporting the International Volleyball Federation. And the actual staging of the Games, the IOC doesn't pay a damn thing. There's no telly money going towards that. All of that cost has to be borne by the host, of which ticket sales and, licensing tat to be sold, probably brings you in $500 million. So actually the costs are all with the host and almost invariably with the public sector. London, which was a relatively modest Games compared to some, came in at $12–13 billion, up to Sochi, $50 billion, $40 billion for Beijing. So it is a gigantic amount of money to spend, and all the evidence suggests that the purported benefits for the host city are either minuscule or more likely negative.
You're an opponent of fixing it in one place and maybe, I would argue, scale it down a bit. I mean, there's things in the Olympics now that are ridiculous. Golf and tennis.
Absolutely.
And so on. Why not put it in one place? Why not put it in ancient Greece?
Well, if you put it in one place, first of all, you're destroying the kind of cosmopolitan, universal quality of the Games. I mean, if the Games has a purpose, it's that, in a very fragmented but globalized world, there is a place where we can collectively go and look at universal humanity. And above all, through sport, which is a non-linguistic medium, which means that elites and masses, people of any language, can engage with this thing. So I think that's a very valuable, you want to hold on to that. But if you just stick it in ancient Greece, A, you've got to deal with the Greek public sector, whose record on looking after monuments and managing public sector expenditure is not good. Secondly, you're saying this global representation of humanity is ultimately derived and beholden to the Hellenic tradition. Now, this is all very well for kind of European gentlemen of a certain era, that says civilization is descended from ancient Greece. But, this is the 21st century. What do people in China think about this? What do people in Africa think about this? They're not. These are intellectual and cultural traditions that don't see Greece as the root. And so I think it would massively undercut that. So I'm against in one place. I think if there is going to be, if we're looking for ways of trying to manage and minimize it, then let's get rid of golf, let's get rid of tennis, let's get rid of football, all of which have global standings as it is. Secondly, why do it over 7 years? You're asking Rio from a standing start to go bang, 7 years, change your city? Of course it's going to be expensive and
so
go
much
wrong.
can happen within those 7
Exactly.
years, as is the case in Rio.
So if you look at Barcelona, which is considered a success, it's because the Olympics were the crowning glory of a period of urban redevelopment rather than the catalyst to get it going. Barcelona have been at it for 17 years and the Olympics eventually brought it together. So I say, give people 15 years. If they want to build a lot of new stuff, penalise them. If they demonstrate expertise and success in raising participation rates in sport, make that a positive rather than a negative. Above all, don't just hold it in one city. The Olympics isn't in one city anyway. When London held the Games, where was the sailing? It's in Weymouth, right? When Beijing held the Games, the sailing is 900 miles away. Why not have a network of cities? Why not hold the Games in the Baltic states, who are never by themselves going to get the Games, but you could have, all around the Baltic, cities could stage some of it. So I think that is, there are possibilities, but to make that happen, above all, there's going to have to be political reform at the IOC, and no one's putting any money on that one just at the moment.
Let's talk about the politics for a minute. As you just alluded, Brazil is now in a kind of dictatorship politically. The president has been overthrown. There's a kind of coup going on in Brazil. Doesn't compare, of course, with the nadir of a politicized Olympics, the 1936 fascist games in Berlin. But it is used, isn't it, by the regime in which the games are being held to gloss up or market their ideas. And I was struck by the extent to which much of the paraphernalia of the modern games has its roots in the fascist Berlin Games of 1936. The lighting of the torch, for example, the running with the torch, lighting and so on. Is that not all a bit dodgy?
I mean, the Games has always had a political agenda from 1896. I mean, Baron de Coubertin thinks that he's re-establishing a kind of neo-Hellenic cult of the amateur athletic gentleman, and he describes the Games as the purpose as a display of manly virtue, for which the reward is the polite applause of women. And for him, the Games is a tableau on which to demonstrate, the new ruling classes of 19th century Europe and North America who play sport as a way of establishing a esprit de corps, and so on. So, it's only because he's a super privileged, white aristocratic man that he assumes his position is non-political, whereas, I'm listening to that and going, really? That's not a political agenda? And the Greek royal family in 1896, who, of course, are of German descent and need to burnish their Greek credentials back the Olympic Games. I mean, your point about Berlin is really interesting in that obviously Berlin's the moment, not merely where it becomes very political, but where you've got enough money behind it to make it the global spectacular that it becomes, of which the lighting of the torch is one element. Interestingly, though, there's another side to that story, which is the 1932 Games in Los Angeles. And it's worth remembering that Liewald and Diem, who were the organisers of the 36 Games, are all in LA, taking notes, taking photographs. And LA brings the pizzazz of the new culture industries, of Hollywood, of the new commercialism to the Games. And that is equally transformatory. I mean, at the Olympic Village, you've got Will Rogers, who is the comedian in the United States in the 1930s, comic cowboy. And he's working as a bellboy because this makes fantastic photo opportunities for him and his studio. Coca-Cola, for the first time, plasters Los Angeles with its product and its advertising. Standard Oil claims the Olympic rings, and there's this extraordinary neon sign of Standard Oil and the Olympic rings spinning in downtown LA. So, yes, Berlin is the first truly great spectacular where you've got the money of a nation state behind you, but LA brings a certain kind of Hollywood celebrity mass appeal to the Games that it had never had before.
Rio, how do you judge it?
Well, as Chiang Lai said of the French Revolution, it's too early to say. I mean, I think the thing with Rio is that the disaster has already happened. I always thought that Rio would put on a great televised spectacular. They did it in 2007 for the Pan American Games, while the Complexo de Alemão, one of the main favelas, was under armed siege. 44 people died during the Pan American Games. It wasn't a problem. So I always thought Rio would be fine. I think the disaster has already happened. I mean, that's the thing. You take the issue of water quality, which is a big talking point at these Games. Guanabara Bay is, full of fecal viruses, sofas, dead dogs, etc. And it's not been dealt with. And the tragedy is not that the athletes have to deal with this, though that, of course, is inconvenient. But the vast majority of Rio citizens are still waiting for their, sewage to be treated. And it's the wasted opportunity, it's the wasted money, it's the misdirection of funds, it's the opportunity costs. And I think that, hopefully if Rio has a legacy, it will be that next time around, much harder questions are asked about how these things are put on.
David, you're a great talker, a great writer. It's a wonderful book, and I'm really grateful that you came on board.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Indeed. And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Well, on the city and the banking, state of banking, AZ gives the answer, nationalize, simples. And Farla Hind says, government can't tell the truth about trillions of toxic derivatives held by the Deutsche, RBS and EU banks, as it would kill the world economy. On the games, we asked for the top Olympic moments, and Ricardo Picasso lays out Clay, Ali, Owens, Bolt. Some of the most influential black role models of all time are the Olympic heroes, and not to mention John Carlos.
John Carlos, but
We met.
yes, Usain Bolt is the only thing I'm going to watch in the Olympics. I have zero interest in the Rio Olympics, as the viewers already know.
Well, that's all the tweets for this week.
Which, alas, means that's the end of the show.
You can stay in touch with us on social media through Twitter at RT_Sputnik or on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.